Hello. So it has been a long time since I've done a YouTube video, but if you follow me on Instagram, you would see that I had asked if any of you had questions about gardening, and I said that I'd answer whatever questions you had in a video. So I figured doing a YouTube video would be a good way to answer that, because it can last longer, and this is probably going to be a fairly long video. Now, most of the questions I got were specifically about starting a garden, so this video is going to focus on that. I'll probably have to do another video to answer some of the other questions I got. So this one will be specifically about starting a garden. And the thing that's tricky about that though is that there are so many variables. I mean, it really depends on your particular area, like your yard, your growing zone, what you want to grow, the space you have available, all of that really depends. So this is just going to be kind of like a general overview of what to consider. Someone did ask about specifically like a 4x8 salsa garden, so I'll kind of use that as my example once we go over the other basics that everyone should consider when starting a garden. So the first thing that you need to consider is sun exposure. So most plants need 8 hours of sunlight. Depending on what it is, you can get away with like 4 to 6. But the fruiting crops, tomatoes, bell peppers, corn, melons, all of that, they need like 8 hours. And usually you want it to get the morning sun with shade in the afternoon. Especially if you are in hot climates, you really want that western shade. So, another kind of important thing you want to have is that southern exposure. And not really, if you're blocked on the southern side and you only have northern exposure, you're going to be kind of limited on the crops you can grow. So if you can have morning light and southern exposure throughout the day, you should be able to grow pretty much anything that you want. And just to keep in mind, the sun does change throughout the year. So after June 21st, like it's going to be right around that time, like straight overhead, right? And then as it goes throughout the summer, it's gonna come around to the southern side, and then it's gonna, after like December 21st, it's gonna switch to where it's gonna be closer to like the northern side of the sky, if that makes sense. So just watch your sun. Keep in mind throughout the year, throughout, the day where you get good light, because you also wanna pay attention not only to sun, but access to water. So if you have like a water spigot nearby, try and plan your garden as close to that as you can. You can obviously run a hose, tubing, whatever, to get your drip irrigation set up in your beds. It's just nicer and easier if it's closer by. And with that being said, I do highly recommend drip irrigation. It can seem kind of overwhelming to set it up, but it's really not that hard once you get the right pieces. There's tons of YouTube videos showing you how to do it. I can even do one showing you how to do it when I expand our garden in the springtime, because it's really like one person can do it, and I can set up a bed in like 10 minutes. So it's super easy. Okay, so next thing you want to think about is your growing zone and figuring out your average final frost and your average first frost, and that will give you how many frost-free days that you have. Now, if you invest in shade cloth or in frost cloth, you can extend your harvest either in the springtime or in the fall, which I highly recommend, because even though you never know when a frost is going to hit, it could be way ahead of when you think it's going to be, like in the fall time. You could have a super late frost in the springtime, and you don't want to be caught off guard. And then with shade cloth in the summertime, say a heat wave comes in, you want to be able to protect your plants, because even though eventually we will have such a robust, healthy garden that our plants will be able to tolerate a lot more of extremes, while you're setting up your garden, it's kind of a fragile system. So you really want to have things in place to help protect your investment, because that's what a garden is. Not only is an investment of like your time and money and energy, but you don't want to lose that to crazy weather, right? So definitely invest in those. Bootstrap Farmer, Johnny Seeds, those are really good sources to find shade cloth and frost cloth. But trust me, like, you're gonna want to have that stuff on hand. And depending on the size of your garden, you really don't need that much. So invest in the good quality stuff. It's definitely worth it. So another thing to think about with growing zones is then there's going to be microclimates within those growing zones. So So depending on where you live in a specific city, your yard might be different than your friend's yard who's across town, even though you're in the same zone. So paying attention to what the weather is like in your specific area, maybe you're a couple degrees warmer, maybe you're a couple degrees cooler. So just keep that in mind. You can get like a thermometer to put in your garden, and you can track that daily if you want to. Have that be an activity for your kids. Tell them that they need to go write down the temperature every day, and you can compare it to what like your weather station is saying, just to get an idea of what's accurate for you, because everywhere is going to be different. So another thing to consider is, depending on what you have space-wise and soil-wise and all that, is if you want to grow in ground or if you want to grow in a raised bed. I've done both. And personally, I actually prefer growing in ground because it's cheaper and it's just easier to get started. You don't need to buy nearly as much compost. Like when I'm starting in ground, I put like 2 to 3 inches on the ground. I use my broad fork to broad fork it in to the soil, to the native soil, and then put in my drip and I'm good to go. Whereas when we built our raised bed garden at our last place, it takes a lot more time and effort because you have to build the beds. And I used wood. Doing it again, I wouldn't use wood. I'd either use metal and paint the outside white to reflect heat in the summertime, or maybe even build like beds out of rock. I think that'd be really cool, and it would help keep your soil cooler if you're someplace really hot. But another nice thing about in-ground beds is they won't get as hot as raised beds would if you're in a really hot climate, just because it has the ground to help keep it cool, if that makes sense. One of the cons with in-ground beds is you will have more issue with weeds. You can put cardboard down, but depending on what crops you're growing, your roots might have a hard time going through the cardboard the first season until it like decomposes a little bit more. But eventually, weeds shouldn't be as big of an issue as they will be when you're first starting, because you're basically establishing an ecosystem. Things will balance out after a couple years, but those initial years, you probably will have weeds. So just kind of keep that in mind. But most weeds, weeds is such a general term, and I'll probably do a video specifically about weeds later. But most of them are completely edible by animals. So if you have chickens or goats or something, that's what I have. And so it is worth it to me to take the weeds out and feed them to the animals. So if you think about it that way, the weeds can serve a purpose, and they serve way more purposes than that, but I'll talk about that later. So let's say you do decide to do a raised bed and you need to fill it. This is an investment because depending on how deep your raised bed is, it's going to take a lot to fill it. I can speak from personal experience. It takes a lot to fill a raised bed. So a couple things you can do. You can get bags of sand kind of as your base. You can do composted steer manure. You can do mushroom compost. You can do worm castings. And on top of that, I would highly recommend adding worms to your garden beds when they're all set up, because they will create the worm castings for you because it's worm poop. They will create that for you in your garden as they're reproducing, and they are just awesome things to have in your garden bed. So just if you're going to try and source bulk compost, and since I'm in southern Utah, I can speak specifically to that it's really hard to find good quality bulk compost down here. If you live like in northern Utah or probably in other states that have better options, this won't be as hard of a thing to find. But if it doesn't smell like earthy sweet, don't use it, because you want good quality stuff, and stuff that smells bad is not going to be good for your plants. So just keep that in mind. If you think you find like a really, really good place to find bulk quality compost, do the smell test. Another thing is you want it to be like chocolate cake. You want it to be dark brown. You want it to be crumbly, like have nice chunks and texture and smell good. If it doesn't have any of those things, it might not be worth putting it in your garden. So just something to think about there. So once you have your beds all set up and you want to figure out what you're going to plant now based off the space that you have available and based off of what your family will actually eat, then you can figure out what you're going to plant. And this is where it gets really fun because you can grow a lot of food in a small space. Definitely stick to things that your family will actually eat, especially for the first year, because there's nothing like spending a lot of time and energy into plants that no one's going to eat. So definitely make a list of what you use the most in cooking. Like for us, we use tomatoes all the time, onions all the time, celery, carrots, garlic. So like those are my main focus when I'm planting my garden, is to make sure I get all of those in first. So once you've kind of figured out what you want to grow, now you have to think about if you're going to start the seeds yourself or if you're going to buy transplants for them, which were started by someone else weeks or months prior. The one benefit of starting your own seeds is it opens up a world of varieties to you. Like there could be 50 different options for what kind of broccoli you could grow, hundreds of different kinds of tomatoes. And what's good about that is you can narrow it down to what is going to work the best for your situation. So say you have a short growing season, you need things that are going to be harvestable quicker. So you can select things that have a shorter maturity date. And you might not have that option if you just buy transplants. Another thing is you can pick ones that are more heat tolerant, more cold tolerant. They're going to do better in the spring, or they're going to be better for overwintering, or they're going to be able to handle, the extreme heat of the summer. So you have so many more options when you start from seed. And con of it though is that it does take initial investment. The seeds really aren't that expensive. It's the stuff you need to start them. You need heat mats, you need shelves, you need lights. I use soil blocks, so I have to buy my soil blocker, but it's a one-time investment. Once you buy it all, you have it, and it pays for itself. If you think about how much it would cost to just buy really good, healthy transplants for everything you'd want to grow, it's worth it. If you do buy transplants, I'd recommend going with like a local small nursery. They're probably going to have better options for your specific area than if you just go to like big box stores. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. So specifically, if you wanted to grow like a salsa garden, obviously you would need onions, you would need tomatoes, jalapenos, cilantro, parsley, probably basil. All of those could easily be grown in a 4x8 bed, enough to have as much salsa as you could want. And the good thing is that when all of those would get pulled out and harvested, you, depending on your growing zone, you could grow an entire winter garden and overwinter crops to be ready to harvest early spring before you planted your next salsa garden. So especially onions and the cilantro and the parsley, those are cooler season crops. So you could start those way earlier, get your tomatoes and your basil and your jalapenos in later once frost has passed. And then once you pulled everything out, you could plant the garden again with more onions, garlic. You could do like broccoli, like sprouting broccoli, some lettuce. And with tomatoes especially, I would suggest getting indeterminate varieties. So indeterminate means it's going to need a trellis for one, but the one plus of that is you can grow more in a smaller amount of space because the plant's going to grow vertically instead of horizontally. So now you will have to keep it pruned so it doesn't go out, because it will. Like tomatoes can get out of control, but if you keep them vertical, like if you have an 8-foot bed, you could fit 8 tomato plants and you could get tons of tomatoes out of those plants. And the nice thing about indeterminate varieties is you will have tomatoes the whole season. Once they start producing, they will not stop until frost hits. Whereas determinate varieties will stop after a few weeks. That's what they're meant to do. They're meant to put out a whole bunch of tomatoes at one time and then die. So if you did that, you'd have to replace them, and you don't trellis determinate varieties. So you would probably be able to fit less in your growing space. But if I was doing like a 4x8 bed, I would orient it like east to west and have my tomatoes on the north side so that they wouldn't block any of their crops from getting the sun that they needed. So that's what I would put them on that side, and then you can kind of orient everything else however you'd want. But you would have, it'd be pretty easy to fit a lot of food in a 4x8 bed if you plan it right. Another thing that I would highly recommend is using companion plants. So companion plants are things that just you can grow with your crops that either like attract beneficial insects, or some of them even enhance the flavor of other things that you're growing. One of my favorite companion plants for tomatoes especially is called calendula. It's an herb and it puts out these beautiful flowers, and they attract so many great pollinators, and my animals love to eat them. You can actually save them for salves and balms and infused oils. So that's a really, really good one to do. Marigold's another good one. If you have a lot of problem with squash bugs, definitely plant dill. I would let the parsley that you planted go to flower. Cosmos is another good one for that. But in a salsa garden, you shouldn't have anything that's really going to attract the squash bugs. You might have issues with tomato hornworms on your tomatoes, but if you have pests, that's usually a sign that your plants are stressed. So I would take a step back and try and evaluate what's going on. Do they need water? Are they too hot? Are they lacking nutrients? So just something to remember when you see your plants are getting attacked by pests, you need to evaluate what's going on. So another thing that I would highly recommend is finding a really good source of compost tea. Now, if you're local to Southern Utah, in spring of 2023, I'm hoping to have enough compost and compost tea that I can sell to locals, because it's really hard to find good quality stuff, like I said previously. But if you can find good quality compost tea, you're going to want, especially in the first year or two, spray your plants with it, completely covering like 100% coverage and the soil about 3 times throughout the season. So once they start, like once you transplant them, or once they put out their first 2 leaves, you would want to spray them. Once they start putting out their flowers, and once they start putting out their fruit, you'd want to spray it again. And this is going to help keep your plant stress-free, and then pest-free and disease-free, and really robust in producing lots of really healthy food for you. So definitely I would start looking for good sources now, because you don't want to be looking for compost tea after your plant's already gotten attacked, because likely their immune system is going to be so compromised at that point, it's going to be really hard to bring them back unless you can catch it really early on. Okay, well, I think that's all I have for you for this video. If you have follow-up questions to any of the things I talked about in this video, you can go over to my Instagram at Lytle House on the Prairie and you can send me a message. Or after I release this video, I'll probably put up in our question box to see if anyone has follow-up questions that I need to clarify on. And then, like I said before, I'll probably do another video talking about some of the other topics that I got asked about. So thank you for watching. Okay, see you next time.